In 1942, the United States was at war with the world. As the military was preparing boys to go to war in the Pacific, Europe, and Africa, giving them intensive training, education, and supplies, weapons, and skills that would enable them, hopefully, to cope with the strains and horrors of war, as well as to become a formidable fighting force, there was one man who responded to the global conflict in a way that might seem unorthodox. He believed that what America needed to win the war was a book. Ernest Hemingway was a journalist and writer who had served in World War I and had been wounded in that war. And when, a few decades later, America entered World War II, he believed that what the American people needed, especially the soldiers, was a collection of what he termed the greatest war stories of all time. This book, entitled Men at War, would include works of non-fiction, historical accounts of war, from Julius Caesar to Livy, from Marbot to Churchill, from the Crusades to the American Civil War, from the Old Testament to the Battle of Midway, which had only just happened a matter of months before the book was published. It also included fictional accounts of real war and fictional battles, from Virgil to Tolstoy to the Red Badge of Courage, an American novella which he included completely and unabridged in this 1,000-page volume. It was a large book, and it could have been larger, but Hemingway said that he wanted it to be just small enough so that a soldier could carry it with him, study it, and internalize it, even in the field. Of course, this might seem like a strange plan. While books are not the first things most people think of when it comes to going on a military campaign, Hemingway's idea was not really that unorthodox. Ever since Alexander the Great, men had carried great books with them on military campaigns, not just for entertainment or distraction, but for inspiration, guidance, and strength. Alexander himself carried Homer's Iliad, as legend has it, sleeping with a copy of it under his pillow. He saw himself as imitating, in some sense, the mythologized hero Achilles. But for a more modern example, take T.E. Lawrence, also known as Lawrence of Arabia. As he was helping lead the Arab revolt in World War I, blowing up train tracks, inspiring tribal leaders over campfires, he carried Sir Thomas Malory's epic of King Arthur and his knights, Les Morts d'Arthur. And it's no coincidence that Hemingway would include sections of Malory's Arthurian epic in his book too, as well as some of the writings of T.E. Lawrence. Far away from Arabia, in the trenches of Europe, Rudyard Kipling was popular among British soldiers, as were the works of Jane Austen. The life of one French soldier was saved as he woke from unconsciousness to find that a 1913 pocket edition of Kipling's novel, Kim, had deflected a bullet and saved his life by a mere 20 pages. Kipling himself would write a short story called The Janeites about a group of World War I soldiers who formed what seems to be a secret society around being fans of Jane Austen's novels. What's less secret is the fact that Austen's novels were given to soldiers experiencing shell shock as a form of bibliotherapy. Granted, it's a far cry from modern, more effective treatments for PTSD, but there's no denying that there is something incomparably tranquil and comforting about Austen's work. Books could distract, entertain, comfort, and inspire, but the right kind of book could also train men for war. History shows us that when it comes to the greatest warriors and military leaders of all time, long before they would ever hear the first shots fired in battle, they were formed by reading, and, more importantly, by absorbing books on war. Take Napoleon, for example. Before he had hit puberty, he had fallen in love with military conquerors. As a child, he was a precocious reader who, according to his mother, had never partaken of the amusements of children his own age. He carefully avoided them, and he found himself a little room on the 3rd floor of the house in which he stayed by himself and didn't come down very often, even to eat with his family. And up there he read constantly, especially history books. As a schoolboy on Corsica, Napoleon's life was filled with books about great men, conquerors, generals, and rulers. Biographer Andrew Roberts says that Napoleon borrowed many biographies and history books from the school library, devouring Plutarch's tales of heroism, patriotism, and republican virtue. He also read Caesar, Cicero, Voltaire, Diderot, and the Abbé Raynal, as well as Erasmus, Eutropius, Livy, Phaedrus, Sallust, Virgil, and the 1st century BC Cornelius Nepos' Lives of the Great Captains, which included chapters on Themistocles, Lysander, Alcibiades, and Hannibal. A contemporary recalled Napoleon withdrawing to the school library to read Polybius, Plutarch, Arrian with great delight, and Quintus Curtius Rufus, for which he had little taste. Polybius's histories chronicled the rise of the Roman Republic, and offered an eyewitness account of the defeat of Hannibal and the sack of Carthage. Plutarch's parallel lives included sketches of Napoleon's 2 greatest heroes, Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. While his contemporaries played sports outside, he would read everything he could about the most ambitious leaders of the ancient world. For Napoleon, the desire to emulate Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar was not strange. His schooling opened up to him the possibility that he might one day stand alongside the giants of the past. And it should be noted that these books wouldn't just affect Napoleon's formation in early life, but would stick with him through his career as a successful military commander. Again, Andrew Roberts writes, "Later in life, Napoleon urged his junior officers to read and reread the campaigns of Alexander the Great, Hannibal, Julius Caesar, Gustavus Adolphus, Prince Eugene, and Frederick the Great. This is the only way to become a great captain. So in order to become great, certainly to become a great leader, you must read, and read widely. Books are necessary." But perhaps an even greater testimony to the power of books is the life of Henry Knox. At the age of 21, the young Knox opened his own bookstore in Boston, Massachusetts, where he stocked books on history, military science, and also questioned soldiers who frequented his shops on military matters. He pored over such classics as Caesar's Commentaries, and like Napoleon, Knox's great interest was artillery, and the tactics surrounding the use of cannon and mortar in battle. Artillery would be where both men would make a name for themselves. When the American Revolution erupted in 1775, an American militia laid siege to British-occupied Boston, Knox and his wife snuck out of the city and rejoined his militia, helping to build fortifications around the city and directing the artillery at the Battle of Bunker Hill. When General George Washington arrived, he was impressed by Knox's expertise. While Knox had only ever had experience as a member of his local militia, John Adams worked in Congress to get Knox a commission as a colonel in the Continental Army's Artillery Regiment. And Knox would go on to play an important role throughout the war, directing the artillery in most of Washington's campaigns, and later founding the Continental Army's first school for artillery and officer training, the precursor for what would become the United States Military Academy at West Point. He would also go on to serve as the first Secretary of War under the United States Constitution. The life of Henry Knox is just another example in the American catalog of self-made men. A self-educated man who, through avid reading and hard work, rose from being a largely uneducated bookstore clerk supporting his family at the age of 9, to being a young businessman, a military officer, and a formative statesman, all thanks to the fact that he could apply the knowledge he had absorbed in books. And it didn't hurt that he was in the right place at the right time. But of course, opportunity isn't worth much if you don't have the ability to seize it. While it can be easy to make fun of people who, like Don Quixote, read romantic histories of the past or novelized stories of a world that never truly existed, and then sally forth to relive events they've read in books, it's important to remember that readers don't always joust with windmills. Sometimes they become competent men. Sometimes they even change the world. And the reality is that men don't often become competent or change the world without doing a lot of reading. This was the philosophy on which Hemingway's book was based. He wanted to collect and consolidate as many of these important character-forming works as he could, so that average men could have access to them, and through absorbing them, they could become wiser, more informed, stronger, more resilient, and ultimately formidable. In a word, he wanted to make men who could win wars. This book provided a sweeping view of what has been done, and it told the would-be strategist what was possible. It gave him a vision for what he could do, even with just a company or a regiment. It demonstrated how an enemy could be tricked, or how an expeditionary force could meet a disastrous turn of fate, whether on land or at sea, and overcome it. This book, of course, does not only apply to leaders. It is just as important for the rifleman, the GI, the individual fighter, to know what he is capable of doing, of enduring, and of overcoming. He too should read about men who have been wounded or tortured. Hemingway himself harkens back to his own fears and obstacles, which he faced when he was wounded in World War I, writing, "When you go to war as a boy, you have a great illusion of immortality. Other people get killed, not you. It can happen to other people, but not to you. Then when you are badly wounded the first time, you lose that illusion, and you know it can happen to you. After being severely wounded 2 weeks before my 19th birthday, I had a bad time until I figured out that nothing could happen to me that had not happened to all men before me. Whatever I had to do, men had always done. If they had done it, then I could do it too. And the best thing was not to worry about it. I was very ignorant at 19, and had read little, and I remember the sudden happiness and the feeling of having a permanent, protecting talisman when a young British officer I met when in hospital first wrote out for me so that I could remember them these lines: "By my troth, I care not. A man can die but once. We owe God a death, and let it go which way it will, he that dies this year is quit for the next." That is probably the best thing written in this book, and with nothing else, a man can get along all right on that. But I would have given anything for a book like this, which showed what all the other men that we are a part of had gone through and how it had been with them. As nearly as it is possible to do so with only 1,000 pages, this book tells you how it was for all those who came before us, from the shepherd boy who used his sling that day on a certain scrubby hillside, to the moment when Admiral Fitch turned to Captain Sherman on the deck of the aircraft carrier Lexington and said, "Well, Fred, I guess it's time to get the men off." Hemingway believed that what people ultimately needed was the truth. They needed to know how things really are, and how they really had been, and this book claimed to give them the truth about war in 1,000 pages. But of course, truth is a multifaceted thing. There are truths of history and truths of science, truths of logic and truths of experience. And in Men at War, the truth came in several forms, including this last and most basic of truths, the personal experiences of men who had been to war. Hemingway writes, "This book will not tell you how to die. This book will tell you, though, how all men from the earliest times we know have fought and died. So when you have read it, you will know that there are no worse things to be gone through than men have gone through before." This book makes us feel at home in the grand fellowship of human life and being. Everything that we face has been faced by people before us. Ever since the dawn of man, we are not alone, and suffering is nothing new. In a modern society that is obsessed with the gods of health, wellness, success, luxury, comfort, and wealth, this book, which is about the strength of the soul within the weakness of a frail and sometimes broken body, surrounded by an environment that is trying to destroy it, this book can help us step into our humanity and embrace our destiny as creatures who are frail and who suffer. It is normal for humans to be cut down, crippled, and battered in the rapids of life before they are ever able to achieve anything like an American dream. Sometimes there comes just a brief season where we don't get to thrive. We just have to survive. Sometimes death comes, and we don't get to do what we wanted in life. We don't get to be with those we love, and we have to meet that as best we can. Men at War is built on the audacious assumption that if a man has done something before us, then we can do the same thing. It may be dauntingly difficult, more difficult than we think we can ever face, but we can do it. And this is especially true of the most basic parts of the human experience. While not all of us will become Emperor of France, slay giants, make the walls of Jericho fall, or encircle a Roman army, we can overcome fear. We can endure pain. We can keep fighting till the last breath. If the situation arises, we can become a second Horatius, guarding the bridge single-handedly. We can still win a greater Waterloo or Saratoga, and perhaps the world is still waiting for a greater and a better man than a Caesar. So far, Hemingway's vision makes a lot of sense. We can understand the concept of emulating successful examples. However, what is perhaps confusing and strange to many of us is the inclusion of fictional accounts of war taken from novels and short stories in Hemingway's program of bettering ourselves and preparing ourselves for trouble. How can a book about the truth of war contain passages from fictional tales like Virgil's Aeneid, or novels like Tolstoy's War and Peace, or The Red Badge of Courage, or Faulkner? The answer is that fiction can convey truth, an idea which Hemingway, a novelist himself, firmly believed and built his career on. He writes, "A writer's job is to tell the truth. His standard of fidelity to the truth should be so high that his invention, out of his experience, should produce a truer account than anything factual can be. For facts can be observed badly, but when a good writer is creating something, he has time and scope to make of it an absolute truth." Thus, when it comes to The Red Badge of Courage, Hemingway says that through reading true accounts, interviewing Civil War soldiers, and combing through photographs, Stephen Crane wrote that great boy's dream of war that was to be truer to how war is than any war the boy who wrote it would ever live to see. When he was writing of the Russians, Tolstoy showed in the greatest and truest detail how the operations were directed. In War and Peace, you will find wonderful, penetrating, and true descriptions of war and people. The account of Bagration's rearguard action in this book is the finest and the best understood relation of such an action that I have ever read, and it gives an understanding, by presenting things on a small enough scale to completely comprehend, of what a battle is, that no one has ever bettered. A French novelist by the name of Stendhal had been a part of Napoleon's army during the winter invasion of Russia. Hemingway says of this fiction writer that the best account of actual human beings behaving during a world-shaking event is Stendhal's picture of the young Fabrizio at the Battle of Waterloo. That account is more like war, and less like the nonsense written about it, than any other writing could possibly be. Once you have read it, you will have been at the Battle of Waterloo, and nothing can ever take that experience from you. You will have to read Victor Hugo's account of the same battle, which is a fine, bold, majestic painting of the whole tragedy, to find out what you saw there, as you rode with the boy, but you will have actually seen the field of Waterloo already, whether you understood it or not. You will have seen a small piece of war as closely and as clearly, with Stendhal, as any man has ever written of it. The whole essence of how men speak in actual war is in Stendhal. In a word, Hemingway had compiled a book which might at first seem like a random assortment of war stories, but which was meant to be a unified tool. A tool of human training, meant to form the heart and the mind. These accounts are not merely for entertainment or curiosity, or for simply remembering history for the sake of remembering. It's a map that shows a territory that is both known and unknown, so that we can keep our bearings in life and have an idea of where we might be going. It's best that we start to understand the unknown before we get there. No matter how much war has changed over the years, or how much technology has progressed, war is still ultimately fought by humans, and it is won by humans. The outcome of a war is a complicated thing, but it is determined in no small part by the quality of your men, their hearts, their wills, their minds, their bodies. No mechanized vehicle is any better than the heart of the man who handles the controls, says Hemingway. So, learn about the human heart and the human mind in war from this book. There is much about them here. It's hard to emphasize just how serious this book was for Hemingway, how much hope and confidence he placed in it. In a very personal note, Hemingway said, "This introduction is written by a man who, having 3 sons, to whom he is responsible in some ways for having brought them into this unspeakably balled-up world, does not feel in any way detached or impersonal about the entire present mess we live in. This book has been edited in order that those 3 boys, as they grow to the age where they can appreciate it and use it, and will need it, can have the book that will contain the truth about war as near as we can come by it, which was lacking to me when I needed it most. It will not replace experience, but it can prepare for and supplement experience. It can serve as a corrective after experience.